blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off.
Hello everyone, this is Ryan, the original outlaw of the airwaves, bringing you a VIP episode of HEROparanormal podcast. Coming to you from the base of La Madre Mountain in the Mojave Desert, south of Area 51. If you haven't checked out HEROparanormal.com, please do. Drop $1 or more a month and become a patron. Boom. You just entered a special club of very few individuals helping me pay for websites, podcasting fees, costs, and more. Plus, you begin to get patron-only episodes for $1. Also, if you want to donate just once and not worry about the monthly recurring, I get that. Just donate once, then hit cancel. You're done. It's that easy. But I must warn you, we are the best deal in the game, in my opinion, with solid content. $8 a month gets you the rabbit hole, premium content, and insider information. Well, sometimes in this amazing existence called life, we see things that closely resemble us, yet don't. We see lights, anomalies, ghost-like apparitions, and we see things our minds tell us shouldn't be there. Or should they? Society tells us they don't exist, whether we see them or not. Bigfoot is possibly the most iconic of these. The new book, Where the Footprints End: High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, by Joshua Cutchin and Timothy Renner, is an absolute must-read and is changing the game of cryptozoology. With no further ado, Joshua Cutchin, welcome to the HEROparanormal podcast.
Hey, I'm doing all right. How's it sound on your end?
It sounds pretty good.
Good, awesome.
Hey, my man, I can't thank you enough for coming on and joining me to discuss like one of my favorite topics. The artwork in the book is so cool too. Did you happen to do that yourself?
No, that's Timothy Renner's work. Yeah,
that's amazing.
In the Bigfoot book.
Yep.
Yeah, that's Tim Renner.
Yep. Well, I got.
He brings. So some people are always like, oh, I want when's the ebook coming out? When's the ebook coming out? I'm like, folks, you don't want the ebook. You want this.
No, you want the hardcover.
Because I think that like there's probably a good 7 or 8 illustrations that you don't get in the ebook that you get in the physical book.
Oh,
so yeah,
it's amazing, and they're really cool. The cover too the creativity is just, it's amazing. If it's okay, I'd like to read a review of Where the Footprints End. Is that okay?
If you'd like to read a review of it?
Yeah. It's just, it's great. Okay, let me pull it up here. I think this is the most accurate review, too. It is...
All right. Is it the one that says it sucks?
No. It's great. It's actually, let's see. It is by Greg Newkirk.
Oh, yeah. He had great kind of things to say. I really appreciate that. He's a great guy.
Yeah, it's okay. So the review is, this book poses a danger to the foundations of cryptozoology. While mainstream Bigfoot investigators would have you believe that people around the world are merely encountering a lost ape, Cutchin and Renner dig into the details they've swept under the rug, excavating countless Bigfoot reports involving glowing orbs, telepathic communication, and paranormal phenomena that have more in common with tales of ancient gods and alien abductions than they do with primatology. Meticulously researched and backed up with a treasure trove of footnotes. Man, is that true? Where this is such a great review. It's amazing. Joshua, like, what got you down this path to writing this book?
Well, I've always had interest in like a bunch of things, and Bigfoot has always been sort of my number one love affair in the paranormal. So, I started writing books. My other books were about, food in the paranormal and smells in the paranormal, and the most recently before this, supernatural child abduction. I actually, this book was not my idea at all. It was my co-author Timothy Renner's. I remember I was actually at the beach, and I was getting ready to have my twins were getting ready to be born in a couple of months, and I said, I'm not going to write anything else because my life's going to get too crazy. And Tim phones me up and says, I want to do the definitive guide to weird Bigfoot. And I'm like, okay. So I cranked out as much of it as I could, as quickly as I could. Having said that, there is still the second volume that's coming out, but I have a real sympathy towards paranormal ideas, unified field theories of the paranormal, those sort of things. In my research and sort of my research into these topics, I've very much landed on the fact that the modern UFO contact experience is almost completely identical to the fairy contact experience, especially fairy contact experiences that you would see in Western Europe. I would argue worldwide they have a lot of similarities, but especially those Western European ones. And I got to the point where I said, I can pretty much find anything in alien abduction lore I can find some precedent for in fairy lore, and that's been very true. That's kind of what Thieves in the Night was. My third book about the child abduction was me trying to work out some of those ideas. Like, well, if this is this congruous between the fairy lore and the alien lore, if it's this congruous, then what about these other things that I had a hard time fitting in? I'm like, oh no, they actually do fit, especially if you turn your head and squint a little bit. But so where I was if the fairy lore is connected to the alien lore, and you have the realm of the dead connected to fairy lore, and the realm of the dead is connected, believe it or not, in some modern alien abduction stories, and Bigfoot is seen alongside UFOs in some cases, like the famous Pennsylvania flats in the 1970s. If there is some sort of unified field theory, like, how does this work? And that's really where all my interests have always lain, is in looking at the consistencies between these sort of ideas. It's not in any individual account's veracity that really attracts me to these topics. It's the consistency between accounts. So I don't know if this person is telling the truth, and I don't know if this person from the Belgian Congo is telling the truth, but their accounts are separated by 50 years, and they're describing the exact same behavior from these entities. So that, to me, suggests that there's some sort of objective reality behind that. And that's what I find really interesting. So this first volume, again, I said it's one of two, really does try to draw a lot of threads between things that we wouldn't necessarily perceive being related to Bigfoot at all. I think it's pretty clear to me that whatever we're dealing with, Bigfoot is a wild man archetype that we as a modern society have sort of skinned onto, or sort of layered onto this phenomena. So, comparing that to alien lore and fairy folklore and ghost lore and ritual magic and witches and this great women in white connection that Tim Renner found, it's been the gift that keeps on giving, because there are these similarities, things that you see in alien encounters that you also see in some Bigfoot encounters that get underreported. So just shining a light on that. It's a long-winded way to say shining a light on that has always been really appealing to me, and Tim's the one who sort of gave me the push over the edge to actually make that leap.
Yeah, and I wish I could have had Tim on as well, but maybe next time. I want to get to that Pennsylvania case as well. Is that the Delta, Pennsylvania, and the Cooper Road story?
Well, I mean, so if you look at the sort of, I believe it was early to mid 70s time in Pennsylvania, especially the work of Stan Gordon up there, was just getting what seems like, if you look back at some of his books, especially Silent Invasion, it seems like he was getting case after case after case of people seeing anomalous lights in the sky and sometimes structured craft in these large hairy hominids, either in close proximity or in conjunction with or immediately after these other sightings. And, Bigfoot appears alongside UFOs in a handful of other accounts as well. I would hesitate to say that it's a common thing, but I would definitely say that it occurs too frequently to be ignored. And unfortunately, the attitude in modern cryptozoology is that it should be ignored, because we all know that Bigfoot must be just some sort of, relatively mundane ape or missing link. And I think there's ample evidence to push back on that. I think the case that you're referring to, the big case that opens up the book, is the Fayette County, Pennsylvania case, where they shoot the tracer. There's this big ball of light that comes down in the field, and they shoot tracer rounds at the Bigfoot.
That's the one. So
this is sort of like the case from that era in terms of just combining up all the high strangeness. There was this gentleman by the name of George Kowalczyk, and he recalled seeing this large ball of light land on his father's farm. And they go up there, and there's this giant orb that's just glowing. And as they go out to the field, they see these there's this whistling sound, and they hear these two large dark shapes with arms extending below their knees, and if there's this thing walking in the glow of this giant orb, and it looks like this giant hairy man thing. They shoot these tracer rounds at it, so that means they can actually see the round, because they're illuminated as being tracer rounds. And even when they were sure that they hit them, and it would just make this sound like dropping a bullet into the water. And that's kind of the main narrative that you hear in a lot of these books, because this case has been talked about ad nauseum. Tim did a great job of digging up some further research. Once Stan Gordon arrived on the scene, the glowing orb was gone. It was still bright enough that he said you could read a newspaper in the center of the landing site. But also, one of the witnesses just went completely deranged, and claimed to have these visions. This was the gentleman I was talking about, Kowalczyk. And he was having these apocalyptic visions of sort of the end of the world and the sort of Grim Reaper thing. And the story just keeps on getting weirder and weirder, because the aftermath is just as odd. He claimed that he didn't need his glasses anymore after having this apocalyptic vision, after seeing UFO and Bigfoot. And he was visited by some people, some individuals who sort of had a Men in Black sort of role. They told him that he should, look into this very, much further. It's a very strange story, and it sort of is the litmus test for which all this other weird phenomena seems to conglomerate. And it's interesting. There are some people who have said that Bigfoot, for the hunter who sees Bigfoot, walking through a forest while they're out hunting deer, yes, it does seem like a large hairy primate. There's no reason to suspect otherwise. But for people who have longitudinal interactions with these things on their property, the people that we would call habituators, they tend to describe things that sound a lot stranger and tend to resonate with things like poltergeist phenomena and hauntings. Sometimes seeing completely separate entities, other than Bigfoot in the same area. Some people claim that, who are long-term habituators, or to have seen, these Sasquatch that appear in the rooms of their house, and just sort of fade away and disappear. And, obviously not everyone is equally credible, but the number of stories that we found going through the research for this book, the number of stories where there was something weird, but it got, as Tim likes to say, weird washed. Like they took just the stuff that makes it sound like a big hairy ape and threw out the weird stuff. It happened time and again. There are two famous cases that I can think of off the top of my head. One, of course, is Ape Canyon, which nobody has necessarily really gone out of their way to deny some of the stranger aspects of that seminal encounter. But at the same time, you hear it in almost every documentary about Bigfoot, and they never talk about the weird stuff ever. And then another one is this case out of Oregon that I talk about in the book that, basically it describes, you could take the narrative out of this particular newspaper article and drop it into a newspaper in 1812 in Ireland, and everybody would be like, oh yeah, it's a fairy story, except it's a fairy story with a giant 12-foot pie, man monster covered in fur. I found that same story in another book about large hairy hominids, and they take all the weird stuff out, which is, in this case, involved unearthly music, this weird domed, illuminated layer of the creature, and this female captive who comes up and says, flee now, for, your life depends on it. It's this interconnected web, just in absolute confusion. But the thing that really becomes clear is that these sort of motifs and ideas dovetail and go back and forth. They tend to cross-pollinate a lot.
I love your comment that is used in the book about consider the company that these things keep, because, it's interesting that you go into detail with the glowing orb. I don't know if I'm going to go against a BFRO NDA or not. I'm going to tread very carefully here, but to not go into any detail, myself and another researcher saw something on an expedition. Moments later, a father and a son saw something, and then they saw a glowing orb. And because they saw the glowing orb, the entire sighting that they had moments later was completely discounted. They took me and the other researcher aside and separated us and got our information, and they told the father and son, sorry, well, maybe next time.
Yeah, it's weird. Like these things, in terms of the company they keep, like that's something I told Tim a long time ago, because we were talking about, I have a real soft spot for taking these things at cryptozoological face value in terms of being what we all thought they were as kids, right? Like, so Bigfoot is a relic hominid, and the Loch Ness monster is a plesiosaur. But then you look at the fact that, Loch Ness and that surrounding area has some really strange occult activity. It's in an area that I would say is not. It's certainly not a UFO dead zone. I'd say that. And then you look at the fact too that none other than Aleister Crowley set up Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness, and I'm like, oh, that sounds like this might be something a little bit more occulted than just a relic species of dinosaur or something. And I love those ideas. They're romantic, and I think that cryptozoology is a truly useful discipline that should be recognized for the powerful tool that it is. I mean, I'm literally waiting any day now for us to have solid proof that there's still a breeding population of thylacine in Australia, the Tasmanian tiger, because there's such good photographic and sort of secondary evidence for the existence of them. And that's truly, I think, where cryptozoology should be putting all its effort forward. But, if you're trying to work backwards from the idea that we're dealing with giant, monkeys, and then you have to try to retroactively fit glowing balls of light in there, I think that's sort of a fool's errand. And stories like that really underscore the fact that these things get really weird really quick.
Yes, and I totally understand what the BFRO and other organizations are up against, because they're already kind of trying to bring science into a fringe area where they just want to stick to the facts, ma'am, type mentality, yet they go, some reports are just not even classified. It's such a gray area, and I think it's interesting that you there is a chapter, and I'm going to mess this word up. I know I am. So maybe you can help me, Joshua. Wildness.
Die Wildnisgeist, yeah. I think that this is a problem that we've seen in ufology too, which is this idea that they just want to sit at the big kids table in the lunchroom. And I made an argue in a collection of essays from back in 20, oh Lord, I guess it was probably 2017 now. It was, basically this idea that we shouldn't shy away from the weird parts of these stories, because science is getting weirder and weirder by the day. I mean, come on, anybody who follows any sort of science magazine in their social media feed knows science is saying stuff that if it came from, Richard C. Hoagland or somebody, one of the fringier kind of people in a lot of these topics, like, we would laugh at it. But it's coming from CERN, and they're saying that they see a dimension that moves backwards. Okay, that makes sense. So not only that, but also, there's this robust, strong tradition that's really pulling the rug out from underneath the materialist, physicalist paradigm. And I think that is no better illustrated than in the work of people like Dean Radin and Daryl Bem and some of these other consciousness researchers who are really at the bleeding edge of this. But, to circle back around to that, the term that you mentioned, Wildnisgeist, it occurred to me a while back, keeping that sort of, the company these things keep sort of mindset. that there were a lot of cases on things like the BFRO website that are Class B reports, which are things that people attribute to Bigfoot, but they don't see at Bigfoot. So we're talking about, strange voices in the forest, strange smells, rocks and limbs being thrown at you, hearing wood knocks, seeing footprints, seeing handprints, gifts being left behind. And it occurred to me that in the absence of Sasquatch, if you take all those things and put them into a house, you've got a poltergeist case. Like, those are all 100% hallmarks of poltergeist case. We think of poltergeist as being, rattling cupboards and banging dishes, and while that is something that happens, a lot of the time the things that manifest are, strange reports, which find precedent in Bigfoot lore with these gifts. Also, rocks materializing and falling from the ceiling inside that are warm to the touch. Well, a lot of these rocks that people get hit with in Bigfoot, these Bigfoot Class B sightings, are also warm to the touch, but people assume it's Bigfoot holding them in their hand. Well, it's also, like I said, a hallmark of poltergeist activity. Smells, strange voices, footprints, knocks especially. I mean, the two places that you'd find poltergeists were around, are generally around an adolescent who typically is going through some sort of trauma or, is pubescent and is sort of coming into puberty, or you find them in seances. And the chief means of communicating with a medium in a seance was by knocking on, the walls or knocking or rapping on the table. And then you couple that, too, with the fact that these poltergeists that were seen in these seances sometimes had physical forms that manifested as large, hairy ape men. So it seems to me that we're kind of describing two sets of phenomena, and the only thing that's really different is the setting. So, I don't think anybody has really ever talked about the possibility of there being, like, a poltergeist that exists outside of a house. So for me, I thought that the idea of Wildnisgeist, from poltergeist is noisy, noisy ghost, geist, or spirit. I thought Wildnisgeist, wilderness spirit, might be a fitting term for these phenomena because, look, people have seen Bigfoot vocalizing, and they've seen them throwing stones, and they've seen them in conjunction with bad smells, and they've seen them, in conjunction with a lot of stuff. So I'm not saying that isn't the case sometimes, but at the same time, if you didn't see Bigfoot do it, you don't know Bigfoot did it. So it's just trying to get people to think in different ways. I think if people would go through the book chapter by chapter expecting some sort of grand thesis where we all tie it together, we can't, because, whatever this phenomena is shares so many attributes so closely with a lot of different other folk traditions that it really isn't possible to nail anything down. The only conclusion that we really reach, honestly, and of course it's split. I mean, if we have any true sense of conclusions, they're going to come in book 2. But so it's split kind of a little bit arbitrarily after the Women in White chapter. But the main conclusion that we have, and I've talked to Tim about this numerous times, is that we just don't know. But if you are intellectually honest about a lot of this data, it seems to push you farther away from the wood ape hypothesis. Which, look, I mean, I grew up a monster kid. I want them to capture Bigfoot. Like, that sounds great. But if I'm looking at all this body of evidence and how even some of these mundane stories have these things that were attributed to witches or to fairies or to hairy ghosts back in other centuries, it makes me wonder if we're not dealing with something a little bit more literally paranormal. I hated the idea of paranormal Bigfoot at one point, but the more I looked at it, I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of, in its own way, semi-explicative. I know that explaining one unknown with another unknown is problematic in and of itself, but if 60 plus, 70 plus years of looking for a large hairy hominid in North America doesn't do the trick, then maybe we ought to try a different angle in terms of how we interrogate these topics.
And Joshua, I think you're right. Like, there's no 100% conclusion, but the consistencies are remarkable, and those simple numbers. I wanted to get into the Gald and Cornell, the generalities of poltergeist activity and Bigfoot, and just how these things are 100 times more active at night. Like, it goes through like 64% of the cases, manipulation of small objects, 58% peaked after nightfall, 48% involved those rapping sounds. It's pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, it was a study. I think, to my knowledge, it's probably the largest study in terms of studying poltergeist phenomena in terms of the data set that they used. They took a look at about 170 years worth of cases. Like you said, it's all things that you would expect of Bigfoot phenomena. There's an increased amount of activity at night. There are a lot of, almost half the cases involve these rapping sounds, which in Bigfoot lore are wood knocks. For some reason, Bigfoot likes to bang on trees or bang rocks together or make these knocking sounds. But it's the exact same form of spirit communication that you find in these seances and in these poltergeist cases. Moving heavy furniture. There was a case from Snellgrove Lake, Canada, where an individual had a cabin that was up there filming for the Monster Quest TV series, and they actually had the cabin ransacked, and this was an area with a lot of Bigfoot activity. It's oddly enough, the moment that they decide to leave for a while, something moves in and just tears the entire cabin apart. Now, of course, that could be like primatological behavior or something like a bear going through the house, but still, that's the kind of thing you would expect from a poltergeist infestation too, is wrecking the furniture.
Now, something that the original, something really interesting that Ron Moorhead, in your book, you mentioned Alan Berry and Ron Moorhead recording a series of peculiar vocalizations. They're known as the Sierra Sounds, and they involve disembodied voices. Could we go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so this book owes a large debt to, obviously Ron Moorhead is a great researcher in his own right, but the Ann Slate and Al Berry book, Bigfoot, which is out of print, but has a bunch of like weird, really strange Bigfoot stories. Some of them are too long to actually make it into either of our books. But Al Berry and Ron Moorhead were in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they would leave a microphone behind. And in several instances, they got what sounded like voices, and the most up-close voices are really guttural and odd and strange. I do an impression. I don't know if we want to do that, but they've been sort of, you can find them online if you just do Bigfoot Sierra Sounds, and they've been sort of referred to as sort of samurai chatter. And there are some individuals who used to be Navy linguistics experts who have come in and said, these frequencies, their overtones, etc., that shouldn't be able to be manufactured by the human voice tract, by the human vocal cords. Basically, he came through with a spectral analysis that said this shouldn't be producible by a human without any sort of, augmentation. But it is this really animalistic, guttural, vaguely Asiatic sort of speech pattern, which is why people call it the samurai chatter case. But Colin Wilson said of the voices that people hear in poltergeist cases, he said they don't sound like ordinary human voices, at least not at first. He says they start sounding guttural and as if it's made up from animalistic sort of grunts and groans. And that's exactly what is captured on the Sierra Nevada, the Sierra Sounds tapes. So again, it's just one of those things. I'm less, I think that all the things that I described in that Wildnisgeist chapter, I think they are coming from some sort of large hairy ape. I just think that large hairy ape sometimes is somehow tied into the poltergeist phenomena, rather than saying it's just poltergeist in the woods. But some of these similarities are just astounding.
Amazing stuff. So I guess wrapping up for our non-patron listeners, and I think it's great how the book really keeps tempo with like tongue-in-cheek humor while delving deeply into the phenomenon. And as an example, can we discuss like the hairy fairies and modern fairy cases like the Little Foot or Little Feet or Little Footprints?
Little Footprints or Little Footprints. Yeah, so, it's interesting. People would say, you can't even begin to, number one, fairies don't exist, which on the surface of that comment, I would tend to agree, but I think that what fairy lore was describing is absolutely dialed into almost every aspect of the paranormal you'll ever find. I think that there's a strong case to be made that if you wanted to approach the paranormal with a fairy lore lens, not only just again Western Europe, but also worldwide, which shares a lot of commonalities. I think you'd be hard pressed to find anything that really falls outside of that sort of mythology in and of itself. But the stumbling block that people have is that fairies are traditionally little people, so how does a large hairy monkey act like a fairy. Well, setting aside the robust number of similarities in terms of their behavior, fairies didn't have to be small. The term fairy is really a catch-all for things that include mermaids and pixies and giants and ogres and trolls and also elves and the wee folk and all these, basically all these different. It's like a Pokemon catalog. I've described it as in the past. And not only that, but fairies could also shapeshift. I mean, there's a tale of an Icelandic changeling who, in the story, in the folk story, it stretches so it's wakes up in the middle of the night when its parents are asleep, and it stretches so hard that it actually reaches it reaches the rafters as it stretches. So the idea that fairies have to be small is a real misnomer. And then once you start digging into the similarities, I mean, the number of little people that were described as being short and hairy. I mean, anything that's sort of a goblin variant. And by goblin variant, I mean, hobgoblins, brownies. I think Peckemderlin was another sort of variant. You'll find these similarities throughout folklore. These fairies being described as short little people with hairy bodies and monkey faces, or at least wizened, wrinkled faces, which could describe a monkey face as well. So it seems to me there's some similarity there, especially when you consider that people in modern America, claim to have seen Littlefoot, which is depending on your own personal ideas, it's either a little Bigfoot, like an adolescent Bigfoot, or it's a subspecies. Sometimes you see them together. And, that could very well be the case, but the number of fairy descriptions, and people still encounter fairies, literally through to this day. People say that, in everywhere from the woods to, rooftop gardens in London, people are still seeing these things. I don't know how much stock I put in those stories, but some of these descriptions still describe these little hairy people. And you couple that shape-shifting idea with the idea that some people have seen Bigfoot disappear and shape-shift and all these crazy things. And it sort of lives a little bit of extra strength to the fairy folk hypothesis. I mean, people say Bigfoot lives underground, and fairyland was oftentimes depicted as being underground. People used to say that if your horse was in the stable with its mane all tangled and woven together, that it was the fairies who came in, or the witches who came in the middle of the night and braided these manes. And there are flesh and blood Bigfooters who claim now that if you find your horse in its stable overnight, it was the Bigfoot braiding horses' manes. So there's a lot of these things that have carried over from the older body of folklore, and we're just grafting them onto this Bigfoot phenomenon. I think that's pretty, in my case, in my sense at least, that's relatively obvious that this is at least part of what's going on. And you look at some of these words. I mean, there are some Bigfoot variants of some First Nations tribes here in America that are literally Bigfoot analogs that are talked about in scholarly fairy folklore. So the idea that Bigfoot couldn't possibly be fairies is sort of, if we're already down the Bigfoot route, why not try to encompass the full, spectrum of weirdness? The other thing that really baffled me is, we tend to think of, the lion's share of Bigfoot prints being, five-toed footprints, and I think that's true. I think most of them are. Volume 2 is going to go into things like disappearing trackways and oddly numbered toes on these footprints. That's what I found interesting, is that, after 5 toes, the most common thing is these 3-toed footprints.
I'm truly so fascinated by the Bigfoot phenomenon, and, 3 toes, 5 toes, who knows? There's so many different variants, like you said. And the most important thing is, where can people go to support your efforts and keep up with what you're doing?
Well, I really appreciate that. As much credit as I've been giving Tim through this interview, I'm the /footnote guy. That's my bag, because I want to encourage people to sort of follow up on what they're interested in and sort of dive a little bit deeper. So that's part of that continuing mission for me. You can find all of my stuff at joshuacutchin.com. That's JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. Tim's work you can find at either Dark Holler Arts, that's Dark Holler, HOLLER, arts.com, or you can also find him at the Strange Familiars podcast, which I'm not only a friend of, but a fan of, and that's strangefamiliars.com. I have, in addition to Where the Footprints End Volume 1, I have 3 other books that are out. A Trojan Feast, which is all about the food and drink offerings in paranormal encounters. The Brimstone Deceit, which is all about paranormal smells, like smells associated with the paranormal. And Thieves in the Night, which is my book on the supernatural child abduction. And Volume 2 of Where the Footprints End should be out. We're aiming for the end of the year. Now, of course, best laid plans and all that, but we're really aiming for the end of the year.
Man, such a great book. I'm so glad that you took some time to talk with us, Joshua, and I hope to talk again. Wishing you the best. Take care, and I hope we speak again soon.
An absolute pleasure. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Amazing, amazing stuff with Joshua Cutchin, am I right? And Timothy Renner. Let's not forget that Where the Footprints End is a must buy. You guys have to read this. Something us ranch owners in shapeshifter territory of Utah are all too familiar with, where footprints actually really do just end. Recently at Space Wolf Research, we had Robert Kreider, who I hope to someday have on the podcast. Anyway, his team Kreider Exploration went through every inch of Space Wolf Research along with 2 Navajo trackers who are used to tracking skinwalkers and shapeshifters in the Four Corners area. They stayed in a 40-foot RV known as the Haunted Flying Dutchman. I'll go into how hard it is to ship a reportedly haunted RV from Chicago, Illinois to shapeshifter territory, arguably the most scientifically studied paranormal hotspot on the planet. Well, the math can be thrown out the window statistically of how it's possible that lightning struck this RV and vaporized it and incinerated it the week after Kreider Exploration left. Not to mention it was a complete loss. Sadly, the RV had just been remodeled by Wes Chestnut and his son, who are Space Wolf Research MVPs, so helpful with stuff all over the property, all over the place, really. Anyway, it was a small price to pay for the possibility of getting humanity's biggest questions looked into, theorized about, and maybe even answered. Is there life after death? Is this reality the only one? Is this dimension what we think it is? How many lives do we get? Is time travel possible? Join Hero Paranormal's patron tier, The Rabbit Hole. $8 a month. Who knows? If we delve deep enough, maybe we'll find out. Or just listen to the free episodes. Also subscribe on YouTube. And check us out on social media. Space Wolf Research. It's under SWR on Facebook. Or HEROparanormal.com. You can find that under Hero Paranormal. Also Hero Paranormal on Twitter or HEROparanormal.podbean.com. Until next time, friends, keep your eyes to the skies, feet on the ground, but don't forget to take a look around.
Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off.